After a struggle, Mr. Howe was placed under arrest and transported to State Police Barracks in Andover for booking. Upon arrival, Mr. Howe appeared to be asleep and therefore had to be carried upstairs to the booking area by officers. When they got to the booking area, the officers noticed that Mr. Howe had stopped breathing. They immediately initiated CPR, called for an ambulance. Mr. Howe was taken to Lawrence General Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 12:45 a.m., November 26, 2009. The Office of the District Attorney is required by law to conduct investigations into all unattended or unnatural deaths in Essex County. In this case, we investigated the facts and circumstances to determine if the police involved in the vehicle stop and subsequent arrest engaged in wrongdoing or excessive force. High-ranking detectives in the Massachusetts State Police Unit assigned to my office, along with senior command staff not affiliated with Essex County, were directed in this investigation by Assistant District Attorney Gerald Shea, a senior trial attorney with 25 years of experience in homicide investigations and prosecutions. The investigation included more than 70 interviews, including every identified civilian witness and every law enforcement officer present at the sobriety checkpoint, medical examiner's office personnel, and Mr. Howe's associates. In addition, the investigation included the death certificate, an inventory of what Mr. Howe had in his possession at the time of his arrest, and a review of Mr. Howe's criminal history. The evidence is clear that police had a reason to approach and question Mr. Howe and did not use excessive force in their arrest despite Mr. Howe's strenuous resistance. The evidence shows that Mr. Howe did not comply with a single request from police to cooperate from the moment the vehicle he was in entered the checkpoint area. Not one witness interviewed said that they observed Mr. Howe being hit, punched, kicked, or beaten by police. The medical evidence reveals that while Mr. Howe had injuries associated with a strenuous physical struggle, he did not have any associated with a purposeful hitting, kicking, punching, or striking with an object. The medical evidence also shows that Mr. Howe suffered from a heart condition and high blood pressure that contributed to his death. Finally, Mr. Howe was in possession of 32 pills that were determined by analysis to contain oxycodone, for which he had no prescription and for which he could have been charged with a felony. Based on the interviews with police and civilian witnesses, this is what happened. As the vehicle in which Mr. Howe was a passenger approached the checkpoint, officers from the Massachusetts State Police and the North Andover Police Department noted that Mr. Howe was not wearing a seatbelt and appeared to be trying to hide something. Based on these observations, an officer approached the vehicle, at which time the officer noted a strong odor of marijuana through the open passenger window. The officer asked Mr. Howe what he was doing. He ignored the officer's question. He was asked to stop moving and show his hands. He did not. And after being asked a second time to show his hands, he struck the officer in her chest and throat area. At this point, Mr. Howe began to struggle with the officer as she attempted to restrain him. He then forcibly opened the vehicle door, striking her and causing her to be thrown off balance. As he began to run, the officer grabbed onto his clothing and ordered him to get onto the ground. He did not. At this time, the officer called for help, and other officers responded. One officer grabbed Howe around his shoulders and ordered him to get on the ground now. Instead, Mr. Howe continued to wildly flail his arms. As Mr. Howe broke free from the officer's grasp, the officer fell to the ground and was kicked in the head by Mr. Howe. At the same time, a pit bull that had been in the back of the vehicle in which Mr. Howe was a passenger gained the attention of the officers because it was loose, barking, charging, and running around. As one officer caught and restrained the pit bull, Mr. Howe again broke free from two other officers. As another officer responded, he was confronted by Mr. Howe with his fist raised. This officer grabbed Mr. Howe's clothing, and both men fell to the ground with Mr. Howe landing on his back, with the officer's full weight landing on top of him. Mr. Howe then managed to roll onto his stomach as other officers arrived and held him. Mr. Howe was still violently resisting and making grunting and growling noises. Officers continued to order him to relax, stop resisting, and show his hands, which he continued to ignore. He kept his hands under his chest as if he were hiding something. Throughout the struggle, Mr. Howe continued to tightly clutch the pills in his right hand and tried to grind them into the dirt and ground while officers attempted to handcuff him. Finally, Mr. Howe was handcuffed and placed in a cruiser. Police then recovered the 32 pills Mr. Howe had in his possession. After Mr. Howe was placed in the cruiser, he was observed by an officer to be breathing heavily, consistent with having been in a physical struggle, and his eyes were open. During the approximately 5-mile drive to the barracks, Mr. Howe was heard breathing heavily and then snoring. Upon arrival, the officer heard Mr. Howe snoring as he secured his weapon and keys. The officer then attempted without success to wake Mr. Howe. After attempting unsuccessfully to carry Mr. Howe upstairs, the officer sought assistance. 2 officers carried Mr. Howe to the booking area. Once in the booking area, the officer noted that Mr. Howe appeared to have stopped breathing, but still did have a pulse. One officer called for an ambulance, and another immediately started CPR. The ambulance transported Mr. Howe to Lawrence General Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Police then recovered an additional 149 prescription pills that analysis determined to contain oxycodone. The events surrounding Mr. Howe's arrest took place in view of a news photographer who was present and taking photographs. The photographer was interviewed as part of the investigation and was asked if at any time he saw a police officer strike, kick, or beat Mr. Howe. He responded that he did not. There were 43 pictures that Mr. Howe was observed, a police officer observed attempting to have Mr. Howe stop resisting. Those pictures are on display here. These were the other exhibits. I want you to understand as well that I spoke to the medical examiner's office. I asked Dr. Niels and Dr. Springer if Mr. Howe had injuries consistent with being kicked, punched, or beaten. They said no. I asked if he had injuries consistent with having been hit by a baton, a flashlight, or some other object. They said he had not. I was told by Dr. Springer in particular that his injuries were purposeful, were not purposeful in nature, and they were a result of a strenuous struggle. I also asked questions with respect to whether or not the injuries that Mr. Howe had suffered would have been a result of a prolonged struggle and injury, and they said that, in fact, that's what they believed had happened, as well as the secondary cause of the death being high blood pressure and heart disease. This concludes the investigation. As in any investigation with respect to a death occurring under police custody, it's important that the public know that there's been a methodical review. There was in this case, and because of that, all the materials here as a result of the investigation are here for the media's full review. All the investigative materials are here and is subject to your review at the conclusion of this press conference. Are there any questions at this time?
I have some. The OxyContin pills, did you say that there's 32 plus 149? Or,
yes.
And are you looking into where he got them and whether he was dealing them, or do you know what the street value would be?
The State Police Diversion Unit has been looking into that and has in fact looked at that. The results are in the investigative file here. The pills that he had in his hand were not pills he had a prescription for. I think it's obvious he was attempting to hide that.
Yeah.
Explains why he attempted to flee from the police. And with respect to pills that Mr. Howe had, he had numerous prescriptions from a physician in the Worcester area.
And what about the coroner's report saying that it was blunt force trauma?
The coroner did not say that. He said ruled it a homicide, and the coroner said that, and a homicide is, I think you understand, is a characterization of the death. It does not denote at any time criminal culpability or murder, and in fact the investigation bore that out.
And in terms of all the photographs that appear to show a struggle, or?
Well, I think the photographs speak for themselves. There's nothing in the photographs denote that Mr. Howe was beat, kicked, or punched. And I think I said before you got here that the news photographer who took the photographs was questioned extensively. He was at the scene, and he stated unequivocally that he did not see Mr. Howe kicked, punched, beaten, or hit with any object.
But what about the pictures that show some of his graphic injuries?
Oh, those pictures, I believe, were taken 3 or 4 days after from the funeral home. And those injuries show bruising, well, lividity and rigor mortis has set in. And frankly, the medical examiner has opined that the injury, there were no tissue injuries denoting a purposeful striking or beating or kicking. And those injuries photographed, I believe, by somebody other than the state medical examiner's office shows natural discoloration after being passed away for a length of time. Excuse me.
Could you tell me who the Worcester doctor is and also whether he's under investigation or he's been charged?
I will not do that. Again, you can review that in the State Police Division unit looked at that. That's all in the files, and I'm making available for the press to take a look at. It's my understanding that doctor, I believe, may in fact be retired right now.
Have you spoken to the family?
I have not. The family has legal counsel.
Are they aware of this report? Do you know if they're aware of it?
I don't know. I'm the Attorney General is representing my office, having been had an action brought against me and medical examined by their counsel. So the Attorney General's office was delivered this report today. The attorney for the family will get the report today as well, the entire investigative file.
Can you tell me whether any law enforcement person is either, aside from the criminal charges, is under investigation or been disciplined as a result of this?
Well, my task as district attorney is to investigate all unattended deaths, and my job and my task was to determine if there's probable cause to bring any criminal action against any law enforcement personnel what happened that night, and we have concluded there is not, and that was the scope of my investigation as district attorney. So there will be no criminal charges brought against any of the 20 state troopers, 18 North Andover police, or the 2 sheriff's department employees.
Could anything have been done in this incident to have resulted in a better outcome?
If Mr. Howe had complied with a single order of the state police or North Andover police, I think there would have been a much different outcome.
I meant by law enforcement.
They did everything according to their training and according to the plan for that evening.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you. The statement's available that we'll give you on the way out.
Could I just ask, should there be any change in procedure or policy in cases like this in the future?
I don't understand your question.
Should there or could there be a change in policy or procedure by law enforcement in cases like this to get a better outcome than this?
I think that's been looked at and vetted many times by the law enforcement on the front end who do this, and I don't believe that's something that I should be commenting on. Thank you very much.